income tax personal allowance thresholds of £12,570 would be frozen until April 2026. In the 2022 autumn statement, the Chancellor at that time, the Right Honourable Member for Godalming and Ash, announced that that freeze would be extended for a further 2 years until April 2028. Following the change of government, the current Chancellor announced in her autumn 2024 budget that freeze would not be extended any further, and therefore income tax personal allowances are expected to next rise in April 2028. While Mr Frost is a pensioner and his petition reflects a desire to boost pensioner incomes, he also believes that significantly increasing the personal tax allowance would benefit those in work, boosting incomes and reducing the need for benefits. That belief reflects the reality that of the 37 million income taxpayers in the UK, less than a quarter were over the age of 65. The vast majority of those paying income tax are of working age and are not receiving the state pension. In its written response to the petitioners, the government highlighted that making the suggested changes to the personal allowance would cost many billions of pounds. And I'm sure the Minister will say more about this when he responds. But I do think cost is a key element to discuss in our debate today. It is Parliament's responsibility to agree the ways and means of any policy it makes. That is, how to pay for what we decide to do. I would gently suggest that events of the last Parliament remind us of how serious that responsibility of ours is. The mini-budget of September 2022 announced tax cuts costing around £45 billion without explaining how they would be funded, and market reaction to that announcement left ordinary people paying the price. An emergency reversal of those tax changes followed, but not before higher inflation and interest rates hit the standard of living. I would therefore urge our debate today to be conducted in full consideration of the cost and funding of any tax policy changes. Were income tax personal allowances to rise in the way suggested by this petition, there would be several other linked tax policy choices to be made, and those choices would determine the full cost of the change. For example, would the size of the tax bands above the personal allowance be maintained in size? Currently, the basic rate of 20% is levied above the personal allowance up to £50,000 of income. Would the size of that band be maintained if the personal allowance were increased by £7,500? If so, the point at which the higher rate of tax takes effect would in turn increase to £58,000, a further cost to the Exchequer. Similarly, the additional rate of tax is currently levied on incomes above £125,000. If the personal allowance were to rise, would that level rise proportionately too? Finally, if the income tax personal allowance, if the income tax personal allowance is currently aligned with the level at which people start making national insurance contributions, should that level also rise to £20,000, or would we return to a more complicated tax system in which income tax and national insurance thresholds were no longer harmonised? I'd be happy to.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way and for introducing this debate. Would he join me in paying tribute to my constituent, Mr Alan Frost, in raising the number of signatures required to achieve this debate? And would he also agree with me that by freezing the level of the basic allowance at £12,570, that bears most heavily on pensioners with limited income who find themselves paying more income tax on small occupational pensions as time goes by?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention, and of course I share him in paying tribute to his constituent for securing this debate. 250,000 signatures is truly an extraordinary level of engagement in the democratic process, and that is to be applauded. I'm going to make some points about the distribution of the benefits of income tax freezes later on in my speech, if I may. The cost of the policy requested in this petition depends on the answers to the questions I've just posed. and perhaps other members may wish to speak about how they would approach such matters in their contributions. But to aid debate, I thought it would be useful to present some indicative costs. And let me place on the record at this point my thanks to the staff of the House, including those from the Petitions Committee and the Library, for their work in helping me access such information. The House of Commons Library estimates that it would cost over £60 billion to increase the personal allowance to £20,000 and make corresponding increases to the tie rate tax threshold, and also to raise the national insurance threshold to £20,000 to maintain alignment. That figure is consistent with the range of costs expected by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who I also met with in preparation for this debate. They estimate that an increase in the personal allowance to £20,000 would cost somewhere in the range of £40 to £90 billion, depending on the choices made on the related tax matters that I've outlined. To put those figures in context, at a minimum cost of £40 billion, this proposal would be at least as large as the tax measures proposed by the September 2022 mini-budget that were then quickly reversed after the economy crashed. At the higher end of estimates of £90 billion, the cost of such a change would be around the same size as the entirety of public revenue spend on education, or 2/3 of the total cost of the state pension. It is not for me in introducing this debate to advocate one way or another, but I do urge members contributing to speak frankly about the costs and funding of any tax changes they favour. I hope it's also useful to briefly provide some context about how individuals throughout the UK would be impacted by increases in the personal allowance. The IFS note that the income level of 1/3 of adults is already below the existing personal allowance. That group, those with the lowest incomes in society, would not benefit from the changes sought by this petition. Those who would receive the greatest benefits would be those who are the best off. That is to say, in net, such a change would be regressive, increasing inequalities of income. I'm happy to take.
Thank you, Mr Stewart, and thank you to the honourable gentleman for setting out the petition's argument. I came to the debate because an unusually high number of my constituents signed this petition. But on that particular point that the honourable gentleman was making about disparities, would you not agree, though, that there is a considerable number of particularly pensioners who are really feeling aggrieved and hard done to at the moment, and rightly so, because of a number of policy decisions, which is why a petition like this, a proposal like this, really is worthy of the government having a proper look at it, and perhaps looking at not just the financial aspect of it, but if pensioners were able to, for example, earn a little bit more before they hit the threshold, they would have more to put back into the economy. And for some, those who are continuing to work, they may want to continue to work a little longer. Thank you, Mr Stewart.
I thank the honourable lady for her intervention. Of course, it was the last government who, I think, harmonised the income tax thresholds, so the same applies to pensioners and those of working age alike, having previously been a different situation. I absolutely recognise the stress felt by pensioners around the land, and I think that's why such a debate is difficult to be had without wider consideration of pension incomes, in particular the maintenance of the triple lock, which is not within the subject of this debate, but it strikes me as important to consider also. So, as I was saying, there is a disparity of potential benefits of a significant increase in the personal allowance between different levels of income, with those earning the most benefiting the most from such an increase. And members may also wish to know, Mr Stewart, that there would also be significant geographic differences of impact in any changes also. Those places with average lower levels of income, for example Sunderland, would lose out disproportionately to places with higher average incomes, disproportionately found in London and the South East. Were such tax changes to be funded by cutting public services, regions like the North East would lose out even more. I hope those matters of context help inform the debate we have this afternoon. So I will end where I started, with a reflection of public sentiment on living standards, because as other members have referenced, there is undoubtedly a strength of public feeling on these matters. We've got to be frank. It's our job here to improve the incomes and the lives of the people that we serve. When I'm out in Sunderland Central every week, this is the key issue that people raise with me. Because for years they've been no better off, because in many cases they're struggling to make ends meet. And I get it. Putting money in people's pockets so they can do what they want, that's the public's top priority. A key part of that is managing the public finance as well. We all saw what happened in the Liz Truss mini-budget with unfunded, half-baked tax plans that were what they did to living standards. Now I'm going to make progress. The public expect us to do better than that, and they expect us to do more. They want to see wages and pensions going up faster than inflation, as is now starting to happen. And they want to see the personal allowance rising. I want to pay tribute again to Mr Frost for calling for those measures, and for all of those who signed the petition. We should be hugely thankful to have citizens who are engaged in our parliamentary democracy, as the 250,000 people who've signed this are. I look forward to an interesting and, I hope, informed debate. I beg to move, Mr Chair.
Now, members will have noticed that the in-chamber clock is not functioning, but if you look at the, you can see the time on the other one. But I think time is probably not particularly of the essence in this debate today. And I remind members, if they did want to speak, they should bob, but I don't think that applies either. The question is that this House has considered E-petition 702-844 relating to the Income Tax Personal Allowance. And I call Tom Morrison.
Thank you, Mr Stewart. It's an honour to serve under your chairship. 1 in 5 people in the UK are now living in poverty. That's around 14 million people. Now, these are people in our communities. They're the people we see at the school gates, they're the people we go to church with, the people we meet every day in our constituencies. These people are struggling to navigate the ever-increasing energy bills, rising food prices and other costs, while their wages don't keep up with inflation. Last year, I was door-knocking in Gatley Village, which sits in my constituency, and it was one of those nights that was incredibly cold, the kind of cold that really bites through your fingertips. And I came to one house where the lights were off. I wasn't expecting an answer, but a woman answered the door, laid up in 2 dressing gowns, and she had 2 small boys behind her. We talked briefly about the issues she was facing: rising energy prices, increases in her mortgage, and the struggle to keep her boys fed and warm. But what really stood out to me was the look in her eye, because that was the same look that my mum had when I was growing up. See, when I was about 13, my mum, brother and I faced homelessness after our landlord hiked up the rent. Now, my mum did everything to protect my brother and I from what was happening, and it's only now that I realise what she was going through. She missed meals so her boys could eat. She would sometimes sit in the dark alone when the electricity meter ran out of credit and we had gone to bed. Now, this was the day-to-day life that we were living. So many years later, seeing those 2 boys standing behind their mother in a freezing cold house reminded me of how important it is to keep standing up for those that are struggling day by day. I therefore want to thank Mr Frost for bringing this debate to the House. I believe that raising the personal income allowance could ease the burden that many are facing, although it has to be when the finances allow. So whether the government does listen to the signatories of this petition or not, more has to be done to help those struggling. The Conservatives effectively raised taxes by freezing the income thresholds for several years. Families and pensioners should not have to pay to clear up the economic mess left by the previous government. So this government must find ways to lower the tax burden so that more people are not dragged into poverty and more families can live in dignity and security. According to Resolve Poverty, formerly known as Greater Manchester Poverty Action, nearly 20% of children in Cheadle are living in poverty, whilst across Stockport it's over 30%. Chair, make no mistake, this should be 0%. And of course, raising the personal allowance will help. But if the government refuses to raise the personal allowance, then it must, at the very least, better support low-income earners who are struggling to afford the very basics. One way the government could act is by scrapping the unfair child benefit cap, which is one of the biggest drivers of rising child poverty. Many charities from across the UK, including Child Poverty Action, Citizens Advice and Save the Children, are advocating for this to be scrapped. As Dan Paskins, Executive Director at Save the Children, said, good intentions are not enough. Children growing up in poverty need action, and no child poverty strategy will be credible unless the two-child limit is scrapped. So I'd like to finish by reminding the Minister of the story that I shared earlier. That mother with 2 young boys stood behind her, doing everything she could to ensure that they were being looked after. No one wants to struggle. No one wants to choose between heating and eating, but it's still happening. And in the 6th richest country in the world, this is not acceptable. The government must do more to help those in work and are struggling to provide more support for those children being dragged into poverty.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And may I start by thanking Mr. Frost for this petition and for the 250,000 people who signed it. I think the number of people who signed this petition does speak to the strength of feeling that the public has about this issue, but it's a serious policy challenge to all political parties. And I think it goes further than a strength of feeling. I regard it as being a cry for help, because right around the country there are struggling families gripped by a cost of living crisis. There are high streets and small businesses gripped by the cost of doing business crisis, and people are crying out for the change that they were promised. Now, most ordinary folk work hard, they play by the rules, they pay their taxes, and they expect certain services and public services to be there for them when they need them. And when they stop working, or even when they become pensioners and may still well be working, what I hear time and again is that pensioners really want certainty. They've worked their entire lives, they know how much money they've got coming in, they need to know how much money is going out, they need to budget. And when a shock comes along, whether it's something like the mini-budget, whether it's a cut to the winter fuel payment, or whether it's sky-high energy prices, they don't know what to do. They have far less capacity than other people to increase their income. And increasingly, we know that pensioners also have a lot of caring responsibilities, not just for their spouses, but often for their children or grandchildren, or even in some cases, their great-grandchildren. So I do take this to be a cry for help. For my part, as our spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats, I would say that I'm incredibly proud that when we were in government, it was our policy to raise the personal allowance, and that policy that went through. And by April 2015, more than 3 million people have been taken out of paying income tax altogether. And it remains our tax priority as the Liberal Democrats to raise the tax-free personal allowance as the best and fairest way of cutting tax when public finances allow. And there, Mr. Stewart, is the rub, because the public finances are under enormous pressure, they are under enormous strain, and at the same time there are very few signs of economic growth. We know that the public finances are in a terrible state, in large part because of the mess left behind by the Conservative government, in part too because of the growth-crushing Labour budget, but also because of President Trump's trade war. And we have this toxic combination that means that people are seeing their taxes go up, but they're not seeing services improve. And it is leading to that cry for help. Now, as has been mentioned by other people already, Mr. Stewart, the House of Commons Library briefing does suggest that its estimate is that this measure alone would cost around £50 billion, and with additional measures about equalising this with national insurance could cost £60 to £65 billion. If I remember correctly, I think the pandemic was a cost of £40 billion, so this is effectively 1.5 of a pandemic, which is a staggering amount of money. Nonetheless, I don't think we should ignore the call and certainly should not dismiss it. There are other things that we could do. We Liberal Democrats have said that the key to sorting out the public finances is to get more economic growth. We think one of the key ways of doing that is to improve our trading relationship with the European Union. Liberal Democrat research has shown that since the Brexit deal came into effect, small businesses have had to fill in 2 billion pieces of paper. That's enough paper to go around the world 15 times. That is red tape, that is the cost of which is falling onto the shoulders of small businesses and through them their customers as well. So if we can sort out that trading relationship and rip away that red tape, then that will improve our economic growth. We've also said on taxes that there are fairer ways of raising taxes. We have suggested to the government they look at increasing the digital services tax on the 20 largest online social media platforms and search engines. We've suggested the government look at increasing the remote gaming duty on those big gaming companies that made an enormous amount of money, billions of pounds in profits, during the pandemic, and who we believe could pay a little bit more to help public services back on their feet. We know that the Labour government has gone some way to reforming capital gains tax. We've suggested alternative ways of reforming capital gains tax to raise even more money than the Labour government has raised, but also to raise that money from the 0.1% richest super wealthy. So there are fairer ways in which this government could be raising taxes from those with the broadest shoulders, those big corporations, bringing in billions of pounds in order to support other people at the other end of the ladder. And we would say there are other things that the government could be doing. So we had suggested, for example, Mr Stewart, that a home insulation scheme is not only good for the planet in terms of reducing carbon emissions, but would reduce people's energy bills. That means that the money that they do have would go further. Equally, by improving investment in our farming and reducing the cost of healthy, locally grown food, it means people wouldn't have to be spending so much of their money on food bills either. So just to conclude, Mr Stewart, I want to thank Mr Frost again and everybody who signed this petition. I think we as policymakers should take this challenge very seriously indeed. We see this as a cry for help from those who are struggling the most at this incredibly difficult time. And I urge the Minister again, as I have done many times before in previous months, to look at some of the suggestions that we Liberal Democrats have made and to engage in those conversations about how we may raise tax in a fairer way and support those who are struggling at this very difficult time. Thank you.
James Wilde.
Thank you very much, Mr Stewart. I think in the last Westminster Hall debate I took part in, we were limited to 90-second speeches, so it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to expand at some considerable length this afternoon. And I thank the Honourable Member for Sunderland Central and indeed to the proposer, Mr Frost, for bringing forward this petition for debate on behalf of the 250,000 signatories, nearly 500 of whom come from my North West Norfolk constituency. And the petitioners have called on the government to increase the income tax personal allowance to £20,000 to help low earners and pensioners. There's probably a bit of a spoiler alert here. I think they're going to be disappointed because we've all seen the government's response where it says there are no such plans. I think it's worth noting that over the last 60 years, no Labour government has left office with the tax burden lower than when it started, a similar position to on unemployment, where it's always left unemployment higher than it inherited. And indeed, the tax burden as a percentage of GDP is forecast to hit its highest level since the Second World War during the end of this Parliament. And the cause of this pattern is philosophical, a belief that there is such a thing as government money, when there is only taxpayers' money, and we Conservatives want people to keep more of it. As the Shadow Chancellor has said, we must drive taxes lower and do so in a responsible manner. Others have referred to the House of Commons library research, which estimates a cost between 50 to 65 billion, depending on the choices that are made on other parts of the allowance, to raise the personal allowance, as the petition calls to everyone, for £20,000. That's about what we spend on the defence budget. So to introduce such a policy, people have to be very clear about the choices that they are proposing, the spending that they would cut, or the increases in other taxes that they would make, or indeed if they would fund this through borrowing. And anyone promising such an increase has to be honest about that and set out very clearly their choices openly. And we as a party will be doing that before the next general election. And it was under the last Conservative government that we, of course, increased the personal allowance significantly to benefit low earners and made that a priority. It increased by 40% in real terms from 2010, from £6,475 to the £12,570 it is today, a change that has benefited millions of UK taxpayers. Of course, I also acknowledge that the last government had to take the difficult decision to freeze that threshold until 2028. That was very unwelcome, unpopular. I don't think it won us any votes. But that decision followed the hundreds of billions of pounds that we put in place to protect lives and livelihoods during the COVID pandemic. Indeed, other parties were calling on us to spend even more, as I recall. And that was support that supported the poorest people than most. And then there was billions more spent in response to the energy price shock. Money, again, that needs to be paid back. However, it's also the case that if the personal allowance has simply been uprated by inflation every year since 2010, it would have only been around £9,650 in 23-24, lower than the current level it has reached. And at the last election, it was Labour who promised not to raise taxes on working people, a promise which they obviously broke in the October budget with the increases in national insurance. And that was justified on the grounds of restoring financial responsibility and economic stability. Again, that's referred to in the response to the petition. But it's hard to see that stability. The government's actions have led to a collapse in business confidence, to see taxes and borrowing rise incredibly at record levels, and growth that was meant to be the overriding priority has flatlined. And whilst last week's cut in interest rates was welcome, it's also the case that Labour's policies are expected to mean that their interest rates stay higher for longer than they would have done under the plans that we had. And only last week, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research pointed out that they assessed the Chancellor would miss her fiscal rules by £63 billion by the end of the forecast period. And of course, that came after the emergency budget only a few weeks ago, which saw rushed cuts to welfare budgets, which I know colleagues across the House are concerned are untargeted. And that was simply to spare the Chancellor the blushes of missing her own fiscal rules. And as a result of the government's actions, questions are being asked about the levels of personal taxation, and particularly the personal allowance, the subject of this petition, which they pledged to unfreeze in 2020. Indeed, the Chancellor made much of this at the autumn budget, saying, and I quote, from 2028 to 29, personal tax thresholds will be uprated in line with inflation once again. When it comes to choices on tax, this government chose to protect working people every single time. I think the second part of that sentence we might disagree about, but the statement was clear and unambiguous about the policy, and it maintained the position that the last Conservative government had to lift that freeze in 2028. But there has been recent reports in the media that this is issues that the Treasury are looking at as they look at trying to keep in the headroom, again, the too limited headroom that the Chancellor's got in place. So will the Minister today give an unambiguous commitment and restate that pledge to unfreeze the personal allowance from 2028? It doesn't obviously go anywhere near as far as the petitioners would want, but at least it would be something. And I want to turn now to pensioners, where the petition refers particularly to the position of pensioners, and the member introducing the petition referred to that. And millions of people in receipt of only the state pension now face paying income tax on it. Of course, many with modest private provision already face that situation. Forecasts suggest an estimated 9 million pensioners will pay income tax on their state pension from April 2026. At the general election, we had a very clear policy, the Triple Lock Plus commitment, that would ensure that people who relied on the state pension as their only source of income would never pay income tax on it. Labour refused to match our policy at that time. In government, they've maintained opposition to it. And the Minister has, despite several parliamentary questions I've tabled to him, been reluctant to give the Treasury estimates of the number of pensioners that he expects to be paying income tax who only receive the state pension and when they will do so. So perhaps he will today come clean with the figures that the government must have about how many pensioners are going to have to pay income tax when all they have in income is the state pension. I assume the Minister is aware of those figures and assessed their impact when they were deciding to cut the winter fuel payments, again, from very vulnerable people. In the last Parliament, I supported measures by the then government to cut taxes for working people towards the end of the Parliament, with reductions in employee national insurance, the last of which, last March, was worth £10 billion. We believe in people keeping more of their own money, and the Minister should today give the signatories of this petition clear answers to the following questions. Will the government stick to its promise to increase the personal allowance from 2028? And is the government committed to not raising the rates of income tax, VAT in this Parliament, and will he rule out any further increases in national insurance rates? I look forward to the Minister's response.
James Murray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stewart, and it's a pleasure just speaking this debate with you as Chair the second debate we have done together in the last few days, in fact. I'd like to extend my thanks, as many others have done, to my honourable friend, the member for Sunderland Central, for opening this debate, and indeed to congratulate Mr Frost, who created this petition. I'd also like to thank all other honourable members who have contributed to the debate today for setting out their views. Now, Mr Stewart, I know this petition has attracted almost 250,000 signatures, and so given the public interest in this topic, it is important that we are debating it here today. I recognise the views of everyone who's put their name to this petition, and let me be clear that as a government, we want taxes on working people and on pensioners who have worked hard all their lives to be as low as possible. We were elected to put more money in people's pockets, and crucially, we were elected to do so in a way that is fiscally responsible, and that is a critical point to understand. We want to keep taxes on working people and pensioners as low as possible, but if we were to follow calls from some opposition parties and abandon fiscal responsibility, that would lead to economic chaos and the collapse of public services, harming working people and pensioners the most. Mr Stewart, raising the personal allowance to £20,000 would cost more than £50 billion. That is more than the £45 billion of unfunded tax cuts announced by Liz Truss in her disastrous mini-budget. Conservative and Reform MPs may have cheered Liz Truss on, but like the British people, we in the Labour Party know the damage it caused, and we will never let it happen again. To put it another way, if £50 billion was taken out of public services, that would be equal to wiping out almost the entire UK defence budget, or slashing the NHS by a quarter. The British people will not be the winners if public services collapse or if chaos returns to the economy. The Chancellor has taken the right decisions to get the UK's public services back on their feet and to restore fiscal responsibility and economic stability. We will fight to protect those hard-won gains from those who want to see them squandered. Within that critical context of fiscal responsibility, however, the government is doing everything it can to support working people and pensioners. At our first budget, we decided not to extend the freeze on personal tax thresholds, meaning people will be able to keep more of their income. We are supporting hard-working families and pensioners through the plan to make work pay and significant increases to the national living and minimum wages and the state pension. And we know that we will only be able to keep taxes down by delivering sustainable economic growth, which is why our plan for change and our trade deals are so important to making people better off. Now, of course, an important context for this discussion is the autumn budget, at which the government reset public spending and put the public finances back on a sustainable path. The decisions at budget were underpinned by the most ambitious package ever to close the tax gap, the difference between what taxpayers owe and what is paid to HMRC, alongside tax changes that made the tax system fairer and more sustainable whilst protecting people's payslips. The government is determined to close the tax gap as far as we can, because making sure everyone pays the tax they owe is critical for a well-functioning economy, for protecting revenue to fund our public services, and for helping to keep taxes on working people as low as possible. And so at the spring statement, the Chancellor went further and faster to close the tax gap, raising an extra £1 billion in revenue for the public finances. Now, turning to the personal allowance, it is worth recognising to begin with that the UK has one of the more generous personal tax allowances in the OECD and the most generous in the G7. It was, of course, as we have heard in this debate today, the previous government who made the decision to freeze the personal allowance at its current level of £12,570 until April 2028. At the budget last autumn, this government decided not to extend that freeze, and we kept the basic, higher and additional rates of income tax, employee national insurance contributions and VAT unchanged, meaning people will keep more of their income. We also, of course, had to take a number of difficult but necessary decisions on tax, welfare and spending to restore economic stability, fix the public finances and support public services, given the situation we inherited from the previous government. I'll give way.
The reason I think that so many people signed the petition is that the plight of some of the poorest and most vulnerable in our society is on our collective consciousness. And I wonder if this would be a helpful suggestion. I declare an interest right away and say my wife is disabled, I'm her carer. But I know of people who are carers who live in terror of the unexpected cost coming their way, like in the North Scotland, the boiler that breaks down, or some horror bill that throws the finances completely out. I wonder if it would be a kindly and humane step for the government, or any government, to say that there might be some mechanism whereby when a nasty surprise bill comes the way of a carer for someone who's long-term sick or disabled, where that could be examined for being offset against tax payable by that person or that married couple or that couple together.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. And of course, having a well-functioning welfare state is in many ways precisely about protecting people when they have unexpected shocks to their lives. I'm not sure the tax system is the best way to address that, but I think the broader point he makes about making sure that the state is there to provide a safety net, if you like, or a cushion against unexpected shocks to people's lives is an important principle. But the focus of the debate today is very much on tax thresholds and in particular the personal allowance. And so I'll return to some of my comments about that. Because, Mr. Stewart, I was saying that when we took office in July last year, no responsible government could have let things carry on as they were. And likewise, no responsible government could now raise the personal allowance to £20,000 at a cost of more than £50 billion, as this is a move that would put public services back on their knees or risk economic chaos that would push up inflation, mortgages and taxes. Now, the petition suggested that raising the personal allowance may lift many low earners out of benefits. We know that our benefit system is currently failing on all fronts. It is failing those who receive benefits by not helping them to work where they can, and failing taxpayers more widely through soaring costs to the public purse. We are fixing this by reforming the benefit system to make it more pro-work whilst protecting those who cannot work. And when people are in work, we want them to be better paid, which is why in April 2025 we increased the national living wage to £12.21 per hour, the third largest proportional increase since 2016, and this is expected to benefit over 3 million workers. We have published the Get Britain Working White Paper, which sets out the government's plans to reform employment, health and skills support to tackle economic inactivity and support people into good work. And our plan to make work pay represents the biggest upgrade in employment rights in a generation, bringing the UK back into line internationally. It tackles poor working conditions and job security, and by making work more flexible and family-friendly, will support our wider programme across employment, health and skills policy to get Britain working. Okay, right.
Grateful to the Minister for giving way. He referred to the Employment Rights Bill. Has he seen the survey from the British Retail Consortium where 70% of the businesses who were surveyed, major retailers employing 500,000 people, said that this legislation would damage their business, and half said it would make them less likely to take people on?
Mr. Stewart, I think many employers recognise that having a productive, secure workforce who can take pride in their jobs and contribute to their fullest ability at work is important not just for the employees themselves, but also for the productivity of those businesses. And that's why we want to see workers with employment rights that will be upgraded through our plan to make work pay, alongside, as I mentioned a few moments ago, a stronger national living wage and national minimum wage under this government. But of course, that is to focus on working people and their rights at work and their incomes. And this petition also raised concerns about the state pension being subject to income tax. Now, it's worth being clear, Mr. Stewart, that in 2025-26, the personal allowance will continue to exceed the basic and full new state pension. And this means that pensioners whose sole income is the full new state pension or basic state pension without any increments will not pay any income tax. The state pension continues to be the foundation of support available to pensioners, backed by this government's commitment to the triple lock. Now, this year, over 12 million pensioners have benefited from a 4.1% increase to their basic or new state pension, and this means those on a full new state pension will be getting an additional £470. And over the course of this Parliament, the yearly amount of the full new state pension is currently projected to go up by around £1,900, based on the Office of Budget Responsibility's latest forecast. Of course, the government also supports pensioners through a range of other means, including free eye tests, NHS prescriptions and bus passes. And for pensioners who are eligible for means-tested support, we provide pension credit and housing benefit. Now, Mr. Stewart, I recognise the substantial support for this petition. Hard-working people and pensioners who have worked hard all their lives want taxes to be as low as possible, and I understand that. However, as we have set out today, we have inherited a mess from the previous government, and we have had to take tough choices to set us on a path to generating economic growth. Raising the personal allowance to £20,000 would undermine the work the Chancellor has done to restore fiscal responsibility and economic stability, and it would slash the funding available for vital public services. This government remains committed to keeping people's taxes as low as possible whilst ensuring fiscal responsibility. Fiscal recklessness hits working people and pensioners the hardest, and so any parties promising to raise the personal allowance to £20,000 would have to explain how they would cut the NHS by a quarter or why they want a rerun of the economic disaster we saw under Liz Truss. We as a government are determined to go further and faster to deliver our plan for change, with its key goal of putting more money in people's pockets by kick-starting economic growth, and we will always keep taxes as low as possible whilst never putting security for families and pensioners at risk. Thank you again, Mr Chairman, and thank you to all honourable members who have spoken today.
The question is that this House... Oh, of course, yes, would Liz Atkinson to wind up.
Thank you, Mr Stewart. I'll just speak very briefly. Thank you to all honourable members for their contributions today. It does strike me that a debate around tax policy can sometimes be somewhat dry, but I do think it's important to remember, as honourable members on all sides of the House have reflected, that there are personal stories and circumstances behind all of the signatories on this petition, and indeed those emails that must be in all of our mailboxes around people struggling to make ends meet, trying to do the best for their families, raise their standard of living, and struggling to do so at the moment. And that's important, I think, to remember in the debate today. So just falls to me to thank, on behalf of the Petitions Committee, the Minister for his response, for all members for contributing today, but particularly to Mr Frost for instigating this petition and all the petitioners. I think we've had a short but important debate this afternoon that is really at the nub of the key economic policy debates facing the country at the moment. Thank you.
Question now is that this House has considered E-petition 702-844 relating to the Income Tax Personal Allowance. As many are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. On the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.